I'm sure that before taking this course, you have written code that contains comments. At least I hope your code contains comments. Or you've read other people's code containing comments, or maybe you cursed under your breath because you were reading other people's code and it didn't contain comments. So that begs the question, what makes a good comment, and when is a comment worth putting in? And I like to say that a good comment is really there to tell you a story that you can't deduce from the code. So let's see what that means. A good comment, and this is not just me, this is John Osterhout, a professor at Stanford who's also a brilliant software engineer. Basically, he sums it up as comments should tell you things that are not obvious from the code, rather than repeating things that are obvious. Now, of course, you might ask, well, obvious to whom? I mean, if you're writing the code, maybe there are things about it that are obvious to you, but they're not obvious to other people. Well, some things could be code invariants. For example, a condition that has to be true in order for some piece of code to work, and that code is written assuming that that condition is true. There may not be a way to put into the code itself a way to enforce the condition, but a comment would certainly be helpful when somebody else is taking a look at that code and figuring out if it's safe to use it or not. Subtle problems that required an unusual implementation. Somebody looking at the code and saying, why did you do it this way when it seemed like this other way would have been easier? Well, sometimes there's a subtle but perfectly good reason for doing that. Or working around a bug. Again, code that looks a little more convoluted than it should might be there because there's some underlying bug that would manifest if the code were not written in just a certain specific way. Strange corner cases related. The easiest way to look at some of this, though, is to actually see some examples of those. So we're going to look at some examples in a moment, and what you want to pay attention to is that in the examples we're going to see, the comments are at a higher level of abstraction than the code. They tell you a story about what the code does, not about how the code is going to do it. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's first look at some comments that are bad examples. This is not a useful comment. It doesn't tell you anything that the code doesn't tell you, and it's at the same level of abstraction. Similarly, if somebody creates a mutual exclusion or a mutex, is there another reason you might create one other than avoiding concurrent access? A method whose name is swap panels and takes two named arguments, panel 1 and panel 2, okay, you don't need a comment to tell me what that method does, which, by the way, is itself a good lesson. If you choose great names for your methods and your parameters, they can be partially self-documenting, and you can avoid that level of comment. So now let's take a look at a comment that's actually good. And here, we're going to jump right in the deep end of the pool, and I'm going to show you a couple of real-life examples of comments from an app that I maintain, and the comments tell you a story about something that took a long time to figure out. Here's the first one. Now, don't worry about parsing all the code, because you know what? That's the comment's job. If you read the comment, it says that the code, which, by the way, I even provide the URL of the place on GitHub where I got the information part of the code, is there to work around a known issue with a particular gem or library that my app uses, in which Rails doesn't correctly compute the next unique ID sequence number in certain cases when you're adding a new entry into the database that backs a model. Now that's a pretty important special case. That's a pretty severe bug. Fortunately, the workaround is well known, and if you followed that link, you can read an explanation of why this problem occurs and why the workaround is what it is. Once you understand that information, reading the code actually isn't that bad. In fact, even when I had to write the code, there's a bunch of model names and things in there that I was not originally familiar with. But once I read the explanation and I saw some examples of other ways that you could work around this, all of a sudden it became easier to do. So here's a comment that gives me, as a developer, everything I need. If I ever go back to this code and say, what was I thinking when I wrote this weird method? There it is, including references to where I learned the information necessary to write this code in the first place. Let's look at another example. This is a similar one, but this was a bug that took me forever to find because it's a workaround for a bug in Rails itself. And those bugs are relatively rare, so I felt that I should really document why this method does the thing that it does. Now, very briefly, you can see that I have commented out a has-many relationship, and don't worry too much about parsing it, but the bottom line is this has-many relationship should have worked. It's syntactically correct, it specifies the correct conditions on the has-many that I wanted, but when I tested the app, it wasn't working as desired. And after quite a bit of debugging, I learned two things. First of all, I learned that there is a problem in Rails itself that prevents this from working even though I did everything right. Second, I realized that as a result of that, I had to do a temporary workaround. And in my case, that workaround was, instead of declaring a has many, I just defined a method in place. And I noted that when I defined the method, it has to behave the same as a scope. So the workaround has to behave the same as the thing I'm working around. Has many would basically return a relation. Therefore, anything that I write would also have to return a relation. Okay, so how did I document this? Notice that it says workaround for this long story number because I use Pivotal Tracker. If I go to Tracker and open up that story, you can actually see that right in the title of the story, it says, when upgraded to Rails 5.2, you can revert this custom method workaround to a stacked scope. Why is that? Well, if you go down to the description of the story, there's a link to a pull request that fixes the specific bug that my workaround is there to protect against. So this is a signal to myself that not only do I know what the bug is, but I also know which pull request fixed the bug. I know which version of Rails that pull request got into because I went through the Rails history information on GitHub, and I've assigned a story for myself as a chore that when I upgrade to 5.2, I can now take advantage of the Rails bug fix, I can get rid of my special case code, and I can use a regular old stacked scope just like I should have been able to do in the first place. So that's a really high value comment because it points me to all the information I need to understand why the code was written the way it is, and at a future time, how I can simplify the code so that it works the way I had thought it would in the first place. And by the way, if you're interested in following through, if you had clicked on that pull request link in the Pivotal Tracker story description, this is the GitHub page where if you scroll down, you can actually see what the problem was. And yes, it says fix association with scope, including joins. And that's exactly what I have there. I have a scope, which is basically has many, and it's got a join with other tables. So that was a lot of fun to debug. By the way, big shout out to my colleague and friend, Professor Pablo Fernandez at the University of Seville for helping me do a nice debugging walkthrough while he was visiting California. Thanks, Pablo. So comments are clearly a good place to put information that tells about what the code does and why it does it that way. But as you probably know, Git will not let you commit code unless you put something in the commit message. So what kind of information should go in a commit message versus what should go in a comment? My rule of thumb is if a developer needs to know the information while they're working on the code, then it's safest to put it in a comment. In the two examples I showed you, the comments were there to warn the developer specifically that it looks like there's a simpler way to do these two things, but I had to do it this way. And in fact, I had to do it this way because of bugs that I had to work around in code that I did not write. So those bugs are beyond my control. I still have to work around them in my app. Which brings me to another topic. If you find yourself putting in comments that are warning the developer, don't do this or be careful about this, sometimes, like in the example we just showed, it's because you're relying on some other piece of software that you didn't write, but you have to work around some kind of a bug or issue in that software. If you're writing warnings about your own code, your code might be trying to tell you something. And it's worth asking yourself at that moment, is there a way I can improve my code so that the warning would not be necessary at all? And the only real mitigation for things like this is code inspection. Having code reviews, having other people frequently look at code as it's being checked in so that things that look sketchy aren't getting in under the radar. That's the reason why when talking about teamwork, we're going to see that frequent code reviews are part of the Agile lifecycle for an effective team.